The transfer paperwork had been processed in triplicate, my EMT certification verified, and my background check cleared without incident. After 3 years of responding to overdoses and domestic violence calls in downtown Sacramento, I thought I understood what stress looked like. I was wrong. Real stress, it turned out, wasn't the chaos of urban emergency response. It was the suffocating quiet of a Yellowstone night shift, where the silence itself felt like a living thing waiting to swallow you whole. My name is Daniel Roses, and I took the seasonal night ranger position because I needed something different. The city had worn me down to nothing. Too many bodies, too much violence, too many nights watching people destroy themselves and each other with methodical efficiency. When the Park Service posting appeared on the federal jobs board, promising solitude and natural beauty in exchange for routine patrol duties, it seemed like salvation. The drive to Yellowstone took 14 hours, winding through mountain passes that grew progressively more isolated as civilization fell away behind me. By the time I reached the ranger station, the sun was setting behind ridges that looked like sleeping giants, casting shadows across a landscape so pristine it felt almost artificial. The station itself was a modest log structure that had been built sometime in the 1970s, functional rather than beautiful, with radio equipment humming quietly behind bulletproof glass and maps covering every available wall space. Chief Ranger Wallace met me at the door, a man in his 50s whose weathered face suggested decades of outdoor work and whose eyes seemed to constantly scan the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the forest. His handshake was firm but brief, and he conducted our meeting with the efficiency of someone who had performed this orientation many times before. Night shift covers approximately 40 square miles of backcountry trails, he said, spreading a topographical map across the duty desk. Radio check every hour on the hour. Emergency protocols are posted by the radio. Medical supplies are in the locked cabinet, keys on your ring. He handed me a standard ranger gear package, radio, flashlight, first aid kit, citation book, then paused and withdrew a laminated sheet from his desk drawer. The paper was worn around the edges from handling, and the text had been printed in bold block letters that looked official despite the bizarre content. Night patrol rules, Wallace said simply, sliding the sheet across to me. Read them. Follow them, don't test them. I picked up the laminated rules and read through them with growing bewilderment. Do not answer if you hear your name whispered from the tree line. Never feed or follow the elk after midnight. Keep your flashlight on, but never point it at the lake. If you see another ranger who isn't scheduled, radio me immediately. Do not leave the marked trails between sunset and sunrise. The rules had the surreal quality of bureaucratic documentation applied to supernatural phenomena, as if someone had tried to codify the impossible into standard operating procedure. I looked up at Wallace, expecting to see some indication that this was an elaborate joke designed to unnerve new rangers. His expression remained perfectly serious. Is this some kind of hazing ritual? I asked, trying to keep my tone light, despite the growing certainty that Wallace wasn't the type of man who engaged in practical jokes. It's survival protocol, he replied, gathering the maps and returning them to their designated files. Yellowstone isn't like other parks. The ecosystem here includes elements that aren't covered in standard wildlife management training. I waited for elaboration that didn't come. Wallace finished organizing his paperwork, checked his watch, and headed for the door with the casual efficiency of someone completing a routine task. Your shift starts at 10 p.m., he said over his shoulder. Stick to the marked trails, follow the rules, and remember that radio checks aren't optional. The forest has excellent hearing, but it doesn't like to be ignored. After he left, I sat in the ranger station and read through the rules again, trying to apply rational analysis to instructions that seemed designed to govern interactions with entities that shouldn't exist. The paper felt substantial in my hands, worn smooth by the fingers of previous rangers who had apparently found these guidelines useful enough to preserve and laminate for posterity. Outside, the last daylight faded behind mountain peaks that rose like dark teeth against a sky already beginning to show stars. The forest settled into evening quietude, not the absence of sound, but a different kind of sound, deeper and more organic than anything I'd experienced during my urban years. Wind moved through pine boughs with a whisper that almost resembled conversation, and somewhere in the distance an elk bugled with a sound that carried loneliness across miles of empty wilderness. I clipped the rules sheet to my uniform pocket and began my first patrol with the confidence of someone who understood the difference between policy and superstition. The trails were well marked, the radio worked perfectly, and the flashlight cut a reliable beam through darkness that felt vast but not threatening. It wasn't until my second night that I learned the difference between darkness that was simply absent of light and darkness that was actively, hungrily present. The northern trail wound through Douglas fir and lodgepole pine in a series of switchbacks that gained elevation gradually, offering glimpses of distant peaks when the moon was bright enough to illuminate the landscape beyond my flashlight beam. On my second night of patrol, the forest felt different, not quiet, but silenced, as if every creature that normally contributed to the nighttime symphony had suddenly decided to hold its breath. I'd been walking for about an hour when I first heard my name. The whisper came from somewhere to my left, just beyond the circle of illumination cast by my flashlight. Daniel. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakably clear despite the ambient sound of wind moving through the canopy overhead. My first instinct was irritation. Despite Wallace's warnings about following protocol, I assumed one of the other rangers was playing an elaborate practical joke designed to test the new guy's nerve. I stopped walking and called out toward the tree line. Very funny. Which one of you is it, Peterson? Martinez? The forest absorbed my voice without echo, and the silence that followed felt deeper than before, more intentional. Then the whisper came again, closer this time, carrying a tonal quality that made my chest tighten with recognition. Daniel, mijo. ¿Por qué no vienes aquí? The voice belonged to my mother, speaking in the mixture of English and Spanish she'd used when I was small and afraid of the dark. She'd been dead for 2 years, victim of a stroke that had taken her while I was working a double shift in Sacramento, but the voice carried every inflection I remembered from childhood, the particular way she pronounced my name, the gentle concern that had made me feel safe, even when the world seemed threatening. I took a step toward the sound before the laminated rules sheet crinkled in my pocket, reminding me of the first prohibition. Do not answer if you hear your name whispered from the tree line. My rational mind understood that voices could be mimicked, that stress and isolation could produce auditory hallucinations, that emotional exhaustion could make the impossible seem real. But my emotional brain recognized my mother's voice with absolute certainty, and the conflict between logic and longing created a physical sensation like being torn in half. I forced myself to continue walking along the marked trail, ignoring the voice that continued calling from the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. The whisper grew more insistent, more desperate, using pet names and childhood memories that no one else could have known. It pleaded with me to come closer, to step just a few feet off the trail, to answer when it called my name. Instead, I maintained my pace and my silence, following the path markers with mechanical precision, while my mother's voice grew increasingly distorted, the familiar tones taking on harmonics that no human throat could produce. The pleading shifted into something that sounded like anger, then pain, then a combination of both that made my teeth ache with sympathetic resonance. Finally, the whisper dissolved into a sound that belonged to no creature I could identify, a guttural howl that seemed to come from the earth itself, rising through the root systems of trees that suddenly shuddered despite the absence of wind. The sound rolled across the forest like a physical force, causing pine needles to rain down in a gentle percussion that lasted long after the howling stopped. When I returned to the ranger station at the end of my shift, Wallace was waiting with coffee and the kind of patient expression worn by people who had seen this scenario played out many times before. "You heard something tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. I described the experience while he listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if my account confirmed details he already knew. When I finished, he refilled my coffee cup and consulted a logbook that appeared to contain similar reports, written in different handwritings. "Rule number 1, he said simply. "You followed it. That's why you're sitting here drinking coffee instead of providing material for another missing person report." He showed me a filing cabinet filled with incident reports dating back decades, each one describing rangers who had heard familiar voices calling from the tree line, who had stepped off the marked trails to investigate, who had never returned to complete their shifts. The reports were clinical, factual, devoid of speculation about what might have happened to create the evidence they documented. "The forest learns," Wallace explained. Closing the filing cabinet and locking it with a key, he returned to his desk drawer. "It listens to our radio transmissions, observes our behavior patterns, studies our psychological vulnerabilities. What you heard tonight was bait, perfectly crafted to exploit your specific emotional history." I wanted to ask how he could speak so matter-of-factly about phenomena that defied every principle of natural science I'd ever learned. Instead, I found myself asking a different question. How many rangers have we lost? Wallace's expression grew distant, as if he were performing mental calculations that included more variables than simple arithmetic could accommodate. Officially, none. Rangers who violate protocols are listed as voluntary resignations or transfers to other parks. Unofficially, he paused, looking out the station window at forest that appeared peaceful in the pre-dawn light. Enough that we develop the rules. Enough that the rules work. Enough that survival depends on following them exactly, without exception. No matter how much your heart wants to believe that the familiar can't become threatening. The sun was rising by the time I finished my incident report, painting the eastern peaks in shades of gold and pink that made the night's events feel like the memory of a particularly vivid nightmare. But the coffee cup in my hands was real. The rule sheet in my pocket was real. And Wallace's matter-of-fact discussion of supernatural predation was real in a way that no amount of daylight could diminish. I had passed my first test by choosing compliance over curiosity, protocol over compassion, but as I drove back to my temporary housing through forest that looked achingly beautiful in the morning light, I understood that the test had been designed not to eliminate candidates who couldn't follow instructions, but to identify personnel who could function effectively in an environment where survival depended on treating the impossible as routine operational hazard. The rules weren't hazing. They were immunization against a landscape that had learned to use human psychology as a hunting tool, and my adherence to them had earned me the right to continue working in a place where the difference between life and death could be measured in the space between a whispered name and the decision whether or not to answer it. Mark Caldwell had been working Yellowstone's night shift for 3 seasons, and his confidence in his own survival skills bordered on arrogance. He was the kind of ranger who knew every trail by memory, could identify animal tracks in moonlight, and possessed the easy competence that comes from successfully navigating challenges that had defeated lesser personnel. When Wallace assigned him to accompany me on my 3rd week of patrols, I was grateful for the company of someone who understood the park's rhythms and hazards. What I didn't anticipate was Mark's complete dismissal of the protocols that had kept me alive through my first encounters with phenomena that defied rational explanation. "Ghost stories for tourists," he said, reading through the laminated rules sheet with obvious amusement. "Wallace pulls this routine with every new hire, builds mystique, makes people think they're part of some secret club. Reality is, this is just a big park with normal wildlife and standard safety concerns, dressed up like a Stephen King novel." We were patrolling the western sector, following a loop trail that wound past thermal features and through meadows where elk grazed during daylight hours. Mark's radio chatter was casual and professional, his equipment handling was textbook perfect, and his knowledge of park geography was encyclopedic. But his attitude toward the rules that had governed my survival since arriving at Yellowstone was one of condescending tolerance for what he clearly viewed as elaborate superstition. "You actually believe this stuff?" he asked, gesturing at my carefully maintained distance from anything that resembled a tree line. "You think something's going to grab you if you step off the trail?" I tried to explain the voice I'd heard on my 2nd night, the impossible accuracy of its emotional manipulation, the way it had shifted from familiar comfort into something that made the forest itself recoil. Mark listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a nervous rookie, occasionally nodding as if my account confirmed his assessment of urban personnel who couldn't adapt to wilderness environments. "Isolation psychology," he said dismissively, "happens to city people all the time. Your brain manufactures familiar stimuli to cope with sensory deprivation. Add some wind noise and emotional stress, and you get auditory hallucinations that feel completely real." The elk appeared around midnight, grazing in a meadow illuminated by moonlight that turned their coats silver and cast sharp shadows across grass that should have been bent by wind but remained perfectly still. There were perhaps 20 animals in the herd, adult females and calves moving through the clearing with the fluid coordination that characterizes ungulates in their natural habitat. Mark immediately started walking toward them, pulling a granola bar from his pack with the casual confidence of someone who had encountered similar situations countless times before. I checked my watch, 12:15 a.m., and felt my stomach tighten as I remembered the second rule: never feed or follow the elk after midnight. "Mark," I called quietly, trying to keep my voice low enough to avoid startling the animals. "We should maintain distance. It's after midnight." He laughed without looking back, already unwrapping the granola bar as he approached the nearest group of elk. "They're herbivores, Daniel. Largest thing they've ever killed was a blade of grass. Watch and learn." I wanted to grab his arm to force him back to the marked trail, to make him understand that the rules weren't suggestions, but survival protocols developed through trial and error, by people who had learned to recognize patterns that defied conventional wildlife management. Instead, I found myself backing away from the meadow, following instincts that had been calibrated by experiences Mark refused to acknowledge as real. The granola bar landed in the grass approximately 10 feet from the largest cow elk. For a moment, nothing happened. The animals continued grazing, their movements natural and unhurried. Then, simultaneously, every elk in the meadow lifted its head and turned to look directly at Mark. Their eyes reflected the moonlight with a luminescence that was too bright, too uniform, too deliberately focused. The sound of their movement changed, not the soft percussion of hooves on grass, but something wet and dragging, as if they were pulling themselves forward through liquid rather than walking across solid ground. Mark stood frozen in the center of the meadow, his confident expression shifting into confusion, and then fear as the elk began to approach with movements that were too coordinated, too purposeful, too intelligently directed to belong to grazing animals operating on instinct alone. "They're beautiful," he whispered, and his voice carried the dreamy quality of someone who was seeing something that his rational mind couldn't process. "They're so beautiful. Look at their eyes." I ran, not toward Mark, but away from the meadow, following the marked trail with desperate speed, while behind me the sound of wet dragging grew louder and more urgent. Mark's voice continued for several more seconds, wonder shifting into confusion, confusion into fear, fear into screaming that echoed across the forest with a clarity that suggested no obstruction between his throat and the night air. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by sounds that belonged to no natural process I could identify. Wet tearing, rhythmic chewing, the kind of organic percussion that suggested large amounts of organic matter being processed by entities that had evolved specialized tools for exactly that purpose. I reached the ranger station at a dead run, my radio already crackling with emergency transmissions as I burst through the door. Wallace was coordinating with other rangers, dispatching personnel to Mark's last known location, organizing a search and rescue operation with the efficiency of someone who had performed similar procedures many times before. The search team found Mark's uniform scattered across the meadow in pieces too small and too precisely separated to have resulted from animal predation, as traditionally understood. His radio was intact but silent, his flashlight was functional but abandoned, and his boots were placed side by side at the edge of the clearing, as if he had removed them voluntarily before walking barefoot into whatever had been waiting among the elk. No blood, no drag marks, no signs of struggle, just fabric fragments and equipment, arranged with the careful precision of someone conducting an inventory rather than the chaotic scatter that would result from a predator attack. Wallace filed the incident report as a voluntary resignation. Mark had apparently decided to leave his position without notice, abandoning his equipment and uniform in a gesture of dramatic rejection of Park Service employment. The official record contained no mention of elk, no reference to midnight feeding prohibitions, no speculation about the sounds I had heard following Mark's final radio transmission, but in the unofficial logbook that Wallace kept locked in his desk drawer, Mark's name joined a list that stretched back decades, rangers who had tested the rules, who had treated protocols as suggestions, who had learned too late that some forms of wildlife management required acknowledging the existence of entities that possessed intelligence, patience, and hunger that operated according to principles that no academic training could adequately prepare personnel to understand. I realized, sitting in the ranger station, while dawn broke over a forest that looked peaceful and normal in the morning light, that the rules weren't arbitrary restrictions designed to limit ranger effectiveness. They were antibodies developed by an organization that had learned to function in an environment where conventional understanding of cause and effect required constant supplementation, where survival depended on treating the impossible as routine operational hazard. Mark's confidence had killed him. His expertise, his experience, his rational dismissal of phenomena that couldn't be explained had made him vulnerable to entities that understood human psychology well enough to use skepticism as effectively as they used hope, fear, or any other emotional response that could be weaponized against. People who forgot that some environments required more than professional competence to survive. The rules worked because they acknowledged reality that existed beyond the comfortable. Boundaries of scientific materialism, and adherence to them, no matter how irrational they seemed, was the only barrier between survival and becoming another name in Wallace's unofficial logbook of personnel who had learned too late that some knowledge could only be gained through absolute compliance with protocols. That made no sense until the moment they saved your life. Mark's disappearance created an administrative vacuum that Wallace filled by assigning me to solo patrols, while replacement personnel underwent background checks and security clearances. The solitude gave me time to think, and thinking led to questions that couldn't be answered through normal channels. If the phenomena I'd encountered were real, and Mark's fate suggested they were then, Yellowstone's night shift, rangers had been dealing with supernatural predation for decades without any official acknowledgement of the threat they faced. During daylight hours, when the forest felt safe enough to explore beyond the marked trails, I began investigating the ranger station's archives. The building was older than its 1970s construction suggested, with basement storage areas that contained files dating back to the park's earliest days as a federal reserve. Cardboard boxes lined metal shelving units in carefully organized rows, labeled with years and departments that had been reorganized or eliminated through successive administrative restructurings. I found what I was looking for in a file cabinet marked Incident. Reports Night Patrol, Division 1963-1985. The drawer was locked, but the mechanism was old enough that a paperclip and 10 minutes of patient manipulation were sufficient to bypass security that had been designed to prevent casual access rather than determined investigation. The files contained reports written in the careful, clinical language of personnel who had been trained to document unusual events without speculating about their causes. Reading through decades of incident summaries was like reviewing case studies in a phenomenon that had remained consistent despite changes in personnel, equipment, and administrative procedures. Ranger Thompson failed to complete radio check at 0200 hours. Search team located uniform and equipment at trail marker 7, approximately 200 yards from Yellowstone Lake shore. Items appeared to have been removed voluntarily. No signs of struggle or animal predation. Thompson listed as voluntary resignation. Ranger Williams reported hearing family members calling from forest during routine patrol. Followed voices off marked trail despite explicit prohibition. Equipment recovered, personnel missing. Incident classified as abandonment of duty. Multiple rangers report elk displaying atypical behavior after midnight hours. Animals approach personnel, make direct eye contact, appear to coordinate movements in ways inconsistent with normal herd behavior. Recommend avoiding contact with elk during night patrol hours. One report, dated 1973, and written in handwriting so careful it looked like calligraphy, caught my attention for its unusual level of detail. Rangers stationed near Yellowstone Lake report water-based phenomena that appear to respond to artificial illumination. Personnel who direct flashlight beams onto lake surface after dark report seeing figures beneath the water, human in appearance but moving with impossible speed and coordination. Entry concludes, the water remembers what we owe it, and payment comes due when light reveals what darkness hides. I photographed the most relevant reports using my phone, building a digital archive of evidence that conventional science couldn't explain, but that showed clear patterns of supernatural activity spanning multiple decades. The consistency of the accounts was disturbing. Different ranges, different years, but identical descriptions of entities that used familiar voices as hunting tools, wildlife that exhibited intelligence and coordination beyond normal animal behavior, and water-based phenomena that responded to human presence with what appeared to be deliberate intent. A separate drawer contained missing person reports filed by families of campers and hikers who had disappeared during overnight stays in Yellowstone's backcountry. The files were thick, dating back to the 1940s, and many contained photographs of people who had never been found despite extensive search and rescue operations. Young couples who had gone camping and vanished without trace, leaving behind tents that showed no signs of disturbance and personal belongings that remained untouched. Solo hikers who had obtained proper permits, followed established trails, and simply disappeared between one ranger check and the next. Families whose children had wandered away from supervised campsites and never returned, despite search efforts that involved hundreds of volunteers and professional tracking teams. The photographs showed ordinary people, smiling faces captured during happier moments, vacation pictures taken before their subjects encountered whatever entities were responsible for the careful placement of abandoned equipment and the complete absence of physical remains. Looking at their faces, I understood that the rules governing night patrol when rangertions weren't just occupational safety guidelines. They were the accumulated wisdom of people who had learned to identify and avoid predation by entities that had been hunting in Yellowstone's wilderness since long before the area became a national park. In the back of the missing person drawer, I found a folder labeled Personnel Training Materials Historical. The contents included early versions of the night patrol rules, handwritten on paper that had yellowed with age. The text was similar to the modern laminated version, but additional entries showed how the protocols had evolved through trial and error. Do not follow game trails after sunset. They lead to feeding grounds that are not meant for human observation. If you hear music playing in the forest, do not investigate the source. The melody will lead you to places where the ground is soft and the bones are old. Thermal features produce sounds that mimic human distress calls. Rangers who respond to cries for help near hot springs risk becoming part of the phenomena they seek to understand. The historical rules had been refined over time, simplified into the essential prohibitions that current personnel received during orientation. But the underlying principle remained constant. Survival in Yellowstone's night environment required acknowledging the existence of entities that possessed intelligence, patience, and hunting strategies that had been perfected through decades of studying human behavior patterns. I spent hours in the archives, building a comprehensive picture of phenomena that had been documented by multiple observers across multiple decades. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and completely absent from any official Park Service publication or training material. Rangers were expected to learn about supernatural predation through direct experience, guided only by rules that worked without explanation and protocols that saved lives without revealing why compliance was necessary. By the time I finished my research, the sun was setting behind mountain peaks that looked like dark teeth against a sky already beginning to show stars. I locked the file cabinets, returned the papers to their proper folders, and prepared for another night of patrol duties that would take me through forest where entities waited with patience that could be measured in geological timescales, hunting strategies that incorporated detailed knowledge of human psychology, and appetites that had been satisfied by personnel who had forgotten that some environments required more than professional training to survive. The rules weren't superstition, they were survival protocols developed through careful observation of phenomena that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of scientific materialism. And my adherence to them was the only barrier between completing my assignment and becoming another photograph in the missing person files, another name in Wallace's unofficial logbook of rangers who had learned too late that some knowledge could only be gained by accepting the reality that conventional wisdom couldn't adequately explain or predict. Eleanor McKenna worked the South Sector patrol route, a circuit that took her through thermal features and along ridgelines where the aurora borealis was visible on clear nights. She was a woman in her early 60s whose ranger uniform was always perfectly pressed, despite the challenges of maintaining military standards in wilderness conditions. Her equipment was meticulously maintained, her radio procedure was textbook perfect, and her personnel record showed 23 consecutive years of night patrol duty without a single violation of protocol or safety incident. I met her during a shift change at the central station, where rangers from different sectors occasionally crossed paths while filing reports or resupplying equipment. Eleanor was finishing her patrol log when I arrived to begin mine, and she offered coffee with the quiet courtesy of someone who understood the value of human contact in an environment where isolation was both a job requirement and a survival necessity. "You're the new ranger from California," she said, pouring coffee from a thermos that appeared to be a permanent fixture of her patrol kit. "Wallace mentioned you've been asking questions about the archives." I accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that Eleanor's hands were steady, despite what must have been decades of exposure to whatever phenomena made the night patrol rules necessary. Her eyes had the particular quality I'd begun to recognize in long-term Yellowstone personnel, a careful alertness that suggested constant monitoring of environmental cues that couldn't be detected. "Through normal sensory channels, I'm trying to understand what we're dealing with," I said. "The official training materials don't exactly prepare you for the reality of working here." Eleanor's smile was grim, but not unkind. "The rules aren't meant to help you understand," she said. "They're meant to help you survive. Understanding comes later, if you last long enough to accumulate the experience." She gestured toward the forest visible through the station windows, where afternoon shadows were beginning to stretch across clearings that would become hunting grounds once full darkness settled over the landscape. 23 years I've been walking these trails. 23 winters of following protocols that work without explanation, avoiding phenomena that exist without apology. I wanted to ask about specific incidents, about the progression of supernatural activity, about the psychological toll of acknowledging reality that existed beyond conventional understanding. Instead, I found myself asking a simpler question. How do you do it? How do you function normally when nothing about this place is normal? Eleanor checked her watch, then began organizing her equipment with the methodical precision of someone preparing for another night of exposure to dangers that couldn't be adequately described in incident reports or training manuals. "The rules aren't to protect you," she said without looking up from her gear check. "They're to appease them. The forest doesn't want us here. We're an intrusion in an ecosystem that includes elements the Park Service can't officially acknowledge. We stay alive by pretending to play along, by following protocols that demonstrate our willingness to coexist with entities that were here long before Yellowstone became a tourist destination." She paused in her preparations and looked directly at me with an expression that carried the weight of accumulated experience. "The most dangerous rule is the one about seeing another ranger when no one's scheduled. They'll try to engage you in conversation, to make you acknowledge their presence. God help you if you listen to what they have to say." Before I could ask for clarification, Eleanor was gathering her equipment and heading for the door with the efficient movement of someone beginning a routine that had been perfected through years of repetition. She paused at the threshold and offered a final piece of advice that felt more like warning than guidance. "If you see someone in uniform who isn't on the duty roster, don't let them speak to you. Don't acknowledge their presence. Don't try to help them or investigate their business. Follow your assigned route, complete your radio checks, and pretend they don't exist. Your survival depends on treating some encounters as if they never happened." After she left, I sat in the ranger station and tried to process the implications of what she'd told me. The rules weren't random prohibitions designed to limit ranger effectiveness. They were diplomatic protocols for coexisting with entities that possessed territorial claims predating federal land management by centuries or millennia. Rangers who followed the rules survived not because they were protected, but because they demonstrated respect for boundaries that existed beyond legal jurisdiction. The forest didn't want human presence, but it tolerated rangers who showed proper deference to its permanent residents. Personnel who violated the rules weren't just breaking safety protocols, they were committing diplomatic infractions against entities that possessed the power to enforce their territorial sovereignty through methods That left no physical evidence, but ensured that violators were never seen again. Eleanor's warning about unauthorized rangers echoed in my memory as I began my patrol route, following marked trails through forest that felt different now that I understood my role as temporary visitor rather than federal employee with jurisdictional authority. The trees seemed larger, older, more deliberately positioned. The shadows fell in patterns that suggested intentional design rather than random distribution of light and obstruction. And somewhere in the darkness beyond my flashlight beam, entities that had learned to mimic human appearance and behavior waited with patience that could outlast individual careers, individual lifetimes, individual administrative cycles that brought new personnel to enforce regulations in territory that had never truly been conquered, only temporarily occupied through careful negotiation with forces that preferred to remain officially unacknowledged. I completed my first solo patrol without incident, following the rules with religious precision and treating every sound, every movement, every variation in environmental conditions as potential communication from entities that had earned respect through demonstrated ability to remove personnel who failed to show proper deference to territorial claims that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of federal land management. The authority. The coffee Eleanor had shared tasted like normal coffee. The forest looked like normal forest, but the reality underlying both was something that required protocols developed through trial and error by people who had learned to survive in an environment where human authority was provisional, human presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, and human survival depended on acknowledging powers that existed beyond any government's ability to regulate or control. 3 weeks after Eleanor's warning, I encountered my first unauthorized ranger during patrol of the northern sector. The figure stood approximately 50 yards ahead on the marked trail, perfectly positioned in the center of my flashlight beam. The uniform was regulation issue, complete with proper insignia and equipment configuration. Even at distance, the person appeared to be conducting routine patrol duties, checking trail markers, examining the surrounding forest, performing the standard observational tasks that comprised the majority of night shift responsibilities. My radio was silent. According to the duty roster, I was the only ranger assigned to this sector until 600 hours. But the figure ahead of me was unmistakably human, unmistakably official, and apparently engaged in legitimate park service business. I stopped walking and consulted my radio, checking for missed transmissions or schedule changes that might explain another ranger's presence in my assigned area. The frequency was clear, the battery was fully charged, and Wallace's evening briefing had confirmed that I would be working alone until dawn. Yet someone in ranger uniform was conducting patrol, activities in territory where no authorized personnel were scheduled to operate. The figure raised a hand in greeting, a casual acknowledgement, between colleagues sharing similar duties in isolated conditions. Professional courtesy demanded that I respond, investigate the situation, coordinate our activities to avoid duplication of effort. But Eleanor's warning echoed in my memory with increasing urgency. If you see another ranger when no one's scheduled, don't let them speak to you. My radio crackled to life with a transmission that made my stomach clench with recognition. Hey there, partner. Looks like we got our wires crossed on sector assignments tonight. The voice belonged to Mark Caldwell, speaking with the easy confidence I remembered from our brief partnership before his encounter with the elk. The tone was casual, friendly, exactly the kind of communication I'd expect from a fellow ranger trying to resolve a scheduling confusion. But Mark was dead. I'd heard his screams, seen the scattered remains of his uniform, read the incident report that listed him as a voluntary resignation rather than acknowledging the reality of what had happened in the meadow after midnight. Radio must be acting up, the voice continued, and I could see the figure ahead adjusting equipment that appeared perfectly functional. Why don't you come up here so we can figure out who's supposed to be where? Every instinct I'd developed during my EMT training screamed at me to respond, to investigate, to render assistance to someone who appeared to need help resolving a professional problem. Mark's voice carried no trace of the distress that had characterized his final transmissions. Instead, he sounded calm, competent, exactly like the experienced ranger who had dismissed the rules as superstition designed to intimidate newcomers. He gripped my flashlight with hands that shook despite my efforts to maintain composure, and forced myself to turn around. Walking away from the figure violated every principle of teamwork and mutual assistance that had been drilled into me during emergency services training. But Eleanor's words carried the weight of 23 years of survival in an environment where following protocol meant the difference between completing your shift and becoming another name in Wallace's unofficial logbook. Behind me, the voice grew more insistent, more personally familiar. Mark began recounting shared experiences, referencing conversations we'd had, using details that only he would know. But the voice also began incorporating elements that Mark had never possessed. Knowledge of my family history, my childhood fears, my personal motivations for taking the ranger position. "Come on, Daniel," the voice pleaded. And now it sounded less like Mark and more like a composite of every person I'd ever trusted. "I'm lost out here. I need help finding my way back." I maintained my retreat along the marked trail, forcing myself to ignore pleas that were perfectly crafted to exploit my professional training and personal psychology. The voice behind me grew more desperate, more emotionally manipulative, cycling through different personas and approaches as if testing various psychological pressure points. Then it began speaking in my mother's voice again, asking why I was being so cruel, why I was abandoning someone who needed help, why I was choosing protocol over basic human decency. The emotional manipulation was surgically precise, designed to override rational decision-making through appeals to guilt, compassion, and professional obligation. I started counting my steps, using the rhythm of movement to maintain focus on navigation rather than the increasingly frantic transmissions that followed me along the trail. The voice shifted tactics repeatedly. Mark's casual confidence, my mother's loving concern, the authoritative tone of supervisors who expected immediate compliance with reasonable requests. But underneath all the variations was something else, something that didn't quite fit the human vocal patterns being mimicked, a harmonic quality that suggested the sound was being produced by anatomy that wasn't quite designed for human speech, words formed by entities that understood language intellectually, but lacked the physiological structures that gave human communication its organic authenticity. The transmission stopped abruptly around 0300 hours, replaced by silence so complete it felt like physical pressure against my eardrums. When I completed my patrol route and returned to the ranger station, Wallace was waiting with coffee and the patient expression I'd come to associate with debriefing sessions following encounters with phenomena that couldn't be officially acknowledged. "You saw someone tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. I described the encounter while Wallace listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if my account confirmed details he already knew. When I finished, he consulted his unofficial logbook and made a brief notation in handwriting that was becoming familiar. "Third reported sighting this month," he said. "They're getting more active as winter approaches, more desperate to establish contact before the seasonal personnel rotation. You handled it correctly. Acknowledgement would have been fatal." He poured himself coffee and stared out the station window at forest that looked peaceful and normal in the pre-dawn light. The entities that mimic ranger appearance have been documented since the early 1960s. They appear to be the most sophisticated of the local phenomena: perfect physical reproduction, complete knowledge of Park Service procedures, access to personal information that shouldn't be available through normal channels. I wanted to ask how such entities could exist, how they acquired their knowledge, how they had learned to exploit human psychology with such precision. Instead, I found myself asking a different question. What happens if you listen to them? Wallace's expression grew distant, as if he were remembering incidents that had been filed under voluntary resignations, but which actually represented something far worse than administrative personnel actions. Personnel who engage in conversation with unauthorized rangers report feeling compelled to follow them off the marked trails, he said. Those who resist the compulsion suffer complete psychological breakdown within hours. Those who comply are never seen again, though their equipment is usually recovered in locations that suggest they walked considerable distances through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate in. Darkness. He locked the unofficial logbook back in his desk drawer and began preparing for the shift. Change that would bring daylight personnel to replace those of us who had spent the night, navigating an environment where survival depended on treating the impossible as routine operational hazard. The rules work because they acknowledge reality that exists beyond comfortable understanding, Wallace said. Your compliance with protocol saved your life tonight. Remember that the next time you feel tempted to investigate something that seems familiar but appears in context where it shouldn't exist. I completed my incident report using the standard language that documented unusual events without speculating about their causes, then drove back to my temporary housing through forest that looked achingly beautiful in the morning light. But beauty in Yellowstone was deceptive, I was learning. A facade that concealed hunting strategies perfected through decades of studying human behavior, entities that possessed intelligence and patience and hunger that operated according to principles that no amount of training could adequately prepare personnel to understand. The rules weren't restrictions. They were lifelines, and adherence to them, no matter how cruel it felt to ignore pleas for help, was the only barrier between survival and becoming another cautionary tale that future rangers would read about in archives that documented phenomena existing beyond the boundaries of official acknowledgement. The storm arrived without warning systems functioning properly, tearing through Yellowstone with the kind of meteorological violence that transforms familiar landscapes into alien territory. Lightning struck repeatedly across the high country, severing power lines and washing out access roads that connected ranger stations to the outside world. Radio communications degraded to static-filled fragments, and the emergency protocols that governed severe weather operations became academic. Exercises in an environment where normal support infrastructure had simply ceased to function. I was dispatched to check Yellowstone Lake during the height of the electrical activity, following procedures that required visual confirmation of structural damage to facilities that couldn't be assessed through remote monitoring. The lake occupied a caldera that had been carved by volcanic activity millennia ago, and the thermal features surrounding it were vulnerable to seismic disturbances that could result from nearby lightning strikes. As the drive to the lake took 40 minutes through forest that looked like a war zone, trees down across the road, debris scattered by winds that howled with voices that almost sounded human, rain falling in sheets so dense that my headlights couldn't penetrate more than a few feet beyond the windshield. When I reached the parking area, lightning illuminated the water in stroboscopic bursts that revealed details that shouldn't have existed. Figures stood waist-deep in the shallows, motionless despite the waves that should have made maintaining position impossible. They were pale, uniformly distributed along the visible shoreline, arranged in rows that suggested deliberate organization rather than random placement. Each lightning flash revealed more of them, dozens, perhaps hundreds of human-shaped forms standing in water that should have been too cold for survival, too turbulent for stability. I sat in the ranger vehicle for several minutes, watching the scene unfold with growing certainty that I was observing phenomena that belonged in the archives rather than routine patrol duties. The figures didn't move between lightning strikes, didn't react to the electrical activity that was turning the lake surface into a mirror of reflected energy. They simply stood and waited, as if the storm had called them to attention for some purpose that remained hidden in the darkness between illuminating flashes. My radio crackled with interference, then cleared enough for me to attempt contact with the ranger station. Wallace's voice came through fragmented but recognizable, asking for status reports on facilities that might have suffered damage during the electrical barrage. "Lake area appears secure," I transmitted, following the standard language that documented observations without speculating about their implications. No visible structural damage to buildings or utilities, but as I prepared to leave, my flashlight beam swept across the dashboard controls and inadvertently illuminated the water through the vehicle's side window. The light touched the lake surface for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for me to see that the figures weren't simply standing in the water, but were actually pressed against the underside of the surface, looking up through liquid that had become as transparent as glass. They moved with impossible speed the moment my light revealed them, surging toward shore with coordinated precision that suggested unified purpose rather than individual reactions to external stimuli. I started the vehicle and attempted to reverse away from the parking area, but the figures were already emerging from the lake, moving too fast, covering ground in ways that defied normal locomotion. The first one reached my vehicle before I could complete the three-point turn necessary to face the access road. Pale hands pressed against the driver's side window, and a face that might once have been human looked through the glass with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like mirrors. The features were familiar but wrong, arranged in patterns that suggested human anatomy, without actually conforming to the structural limitations that governed normal facial architecture. More figures surrounded the vehicle, moving with the fluid coordination I'd observed in the elk during Mark's final patrol. They didn't attempt to break the glass or force entry through mechanical means. Instead, they began speaking in voices that carried clearly through the metal and glass that separated us. "Daniel," they called in perfect unison, using my mother's voice multiplied by dozens of throats. "Come home, mijo. We've been waiting so long." The voices shifted and overlapped, cycling through every person I'd ever loved, every voice that carried emotional significance, every combination of words and tone that could trigger involuntary responses conditioned by years of human connection. They spoke in languages I recognized and languages I didn't, but the meaning was always the same: invitation, welcome, the promise of reunion with people I'd lost. I closed my eyes and forced myself to remember Eleanor's teachings about appeasement rather than resistance, protocols that acknowledged the territorial sovereignty of entities that had occupied this landscape since long before human settlement. The rules weren't designed to help me fight these creatures. They were designed to help me coexist with them, to demonstrate proper respect for boundaries I'd inadvertently violated. "I'm sorry," I said aloud, speaking to entities that could hear through glass and metal and atmospheric distortion. "I didn't mean to look. I didn't mean to intrude. I'll follow the rules." The voices outside the vehicle grew quiet, as if considering my apology. I began reciting the night patrol protocols like a prayer, acknowledging each prohibition as a promise of future compliance. "Do not answer if you hear your name whispered from the tree line. Never feed or follow the elk after midnight. Keep your flashlight on but never point it at the lake." The figures stepped away from the vehicle with movements that were too coordinated to be coincidental, too precisely timed to result from individual decisions. They retreated toward the water in formation, maintaining eye contact through the windows until they slipped beneath the surface with barely a ripple to mark their passage. The storm quieted, as if responding to some signal I couldn't detect. The wind died to whispers, the lightning moved off toward distant peaks, and the rain shifted from downpour to gentle percussion that made the lake surface dance with expanding circles that reflected starlight. Beginning to show through breaking clouds, sat in the parking area for another 20 minutes, waiting for my hands to stop shaking enough to operate the vehicle controls safely. When I finally drove back to the ranger station, Wallace was waiting with coffee and the kind of patient expression that suggested he'd been monitoring radio transmissions that revealed more information than my official status reports had provided. "You survived the lake," he said simply. "Most rangers who encounter them don't make it back to file reports." I described the incident while Wallace listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, as if my account confirmed details from previous encounters that had ended differently. When I finished, he consulted his unofficial logbook and made notations that seemed to involve more variables than simple documentation would require. "The entities in the lake are the oldest," he said. "They predate Park Service jurisdiction by centuries, possibly millennia. They respond to acknowledgement of territorial sovereignty, but only if the apology is genuine and the promise of future compliance is credible." He locked the logbook back in his desk drawer and began organizing paperwork that documented phenomena existing beyond official acknowledgement, but requiring careful management by personnel who had learned to navigate reality that extended beyond comfortable understanding. "You passed the final test," Wallace said. "Not many rangers survive direct contact with lake entities. Those who do understand that survival here isn't about imposing human authority on supernatural phenomena. It's about learning to coexist with forces that were ancient when our species was still developing the cognitive capacity to recognize patterns in environmental data. The storm had been more than meteorological event. It had been examination, assessment of my ability to function effectively in an environment where conventional training provided insufficient preparation for challenges that required acknowledging reality beyond scientific materialism. I had survived not through superior equipment or tactical knowledge, but through acceptance of protocols that worked without explanation and respect for entities that possessed territorial claims predating any government's authority to regulate or control. The rules had held, the apologies had been accepted, and I had earned the right to continue working in a place where survival depended on treating the impossible as routine operational hazard, where human presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, and where the difference between life and death could be measured in the space between recognition and acknowledgement, between curiosity and compliance with wisdom that had been accumulated through decades of learning to coexist with entities that possessed patience, intelligence, and territorial sovereignty that no amount of federal jurisdiction could adequately address or override. Dawn arrived with the crystalline clarity that follows severe weather, painting Yellowstone's peaks in shades of gold and rose that made the previous night's events feel like the memory of a particularly vivid nightmare. The lake reflected morning light with perfect stillness, no trace of the figures that had emerged during the storm, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred during the hours when lightning had revealed entities that preferred to remain unobserved by human personnel. I completed my incident report using the careful language that had evolved to document supernatural encounters without acknowledging their true nature. Severe electrical activity resulted in temporary visibility issues near Yellowstone Lake. No structural damage observed to park facilities. Equipment functioning normally following weather event. Wallace accepted the report without comment, filing it with other routine documentation that disguised extraordinary events as mundane administrative tasks. But when the shift change brought daylight personnel to replace those of us who had spent the night navigating an environment where survival depended on protocols that couldn't be officially acknowledged, Wallace offered observations that felt more like graduation ceremony than debriefing session. "You lasted the storm," he said, pouring coffee from a pot that had become a fixture of our post-patrol conversations. "Most rangers who encounter the lake entities don't survive to discuss the experience. Those who do understand that they've passed beyond training phase into something resembling permanent assignment. I understood that I was no longer a seasonal employee learning park procedures, but a permanent member of personnel who had demonstrated ability to function effectively in an environment where conventional training provided insufficient preparation for challenges that required acknowledging reality beyond comfortable understanding. The transformation wasn't marked by ceremony or official recognition. It was simply the quiet acceptance that I belonged to a community of people who had learned to navigate territory where human authority was provisional and human survival depended on respecting forces that existed beyond any government's ability to regulate. But survival in Yellowstone's night environment came with costs that weren't itemized in employment, contracts, or training materials. Even during daylight hours, when the forest felt safe enough to explore beyond marked trails, I found myself constantly monitoring environmental cues for signs of supernatural activity. Every sound carried potential significance. Every shadow suggested possible concealment of entities that might be studying my behavior patterns for future exploitation. The whispers started 3 days after the storm. Not the obvious supernatural communication I'd learned to recognize and ignore, but subtle audio phenomena that existed at the threshold of conscious perception. Voices that might have been wind through pine boughs, conversations that could have been distant radio transmissions, fragments of familiar languages that dissolved into static whenever I tried to focus on their content. During patrols, elk grazed closer to the marked trails than wildlife management protocols recommended, maintaining eye contact that lasted longer than normal animal behavior could explain. Their movements remained coordinated in ways that suggested communication methods beyond the vocalizations documented in conventional wildlife studies, and their presence during night hours felt deliberate rather than coincidental. The lake had become a constant presence in my peripheral awareness, even when patrol routes took me miles from its shores. I could feel it like a weight on the horizon, a gravitational influence that affected the rhythm of my walking, the pattern of my breathing, the direction of my attention during quiet moments when the forest settled into the deep silence that preceded supernatural activity. Sleep became problematic. Even in my temporary housing, surrounded by the familiar comforts of electric lighting and modern construction, I dreamed of figures standing in cold water, waiting with patience that could outlast individual lifetimes for personnel who would eventually violate protocols and provide opportunities for closer examination of human psychology and physiology. The dreams weren't nightmares in any conventional sense. They were more like briefing sessions, educational materials that provided information about entities that had learned to coexist with human presence through careful study of our behavioral patterns and psychological vulnerabilities. I woke each morning with knowledge I hadn't possessed the night before, understanding of territorial boundaries and diplomatic protocols that hadn't been covered in any training manual. Wallace noticed the changes during our regular debriefing sessions. The subtle shift in my demeanor, from someone learning to cope with unusual job requirements to someone who had internalized understanding that went beyond mere compliance with safety protocols. He began including me in conversations about long-term personnel management, discussions that involve considerations extending far beyond seasonal employment cycles. The park changes people, he said during one evening briefing that covered topics not found in official administrative procedures, extended exposure to phenomena that exist beyond conventional understanding, tends to calibrate human perception to recognize patterns that most people never learn to see. It's not psychological damage, it's expansion of awareness to include information that helps personnel function more effectively in environments where normal training provides insufficient preparation. Eleanor stopped by the station more frequently, sharing coffee and observations about seasonal changes that affected supernatural activity levels. Her conversations included practical advice about managing the psychological pressure of acknowledging reality that existed beyond comfortable boundaries of scientific materialism. 24 years now, she said, checking her watch with the precision of someone tracking time according to schedules that extended beyond normal administrative cycles. 24 winters of walking trails where entities study human behavior with scientific methodology, where survival depends on respecting territorial claims that predate federal jurisdiction by millennia. She gestured toward forest visible through station windows, where afternoon shadows were beginning to stretch across clearings that would become hunting grounds once full darkness settled over the landscape. The isolation gets easier. The constant vigilance becomes second nature. But the knowledge never stops accumulating, understanding of how they think, how they hunt, how they've learned to use human psychology as effectively as they use environmental advantages. I realized that I had become part of a community that existed within but separate from normal park service operations, personnel who had learned to navigate reality that couldn't be officially acknowledged, but which required careful management by people who understood that some environments included elements beyond conventional wildlife management protocols. We were wardens of secrets too old for institutional memory, caretakers of territorial boundaries that existed beyond any government's authority to regulate. The rules had become second nature, automatic responses calibrated by experience rather than conscious decision-making. But compliance with protocols was no longer sufficient. I needed to understand the underlying principles that made the rules effective, to develop intuitive recognition of situations that required improvisation beyond standard procedures. Yellowstone was no longer just my workplace. It was my responsibility, my territory, my burden to bear with the patience and precision that came from acknowledging that some knowledge could only be gained through survival. Some survival could only be achieved through absolute compliance with wisdom that had been accumulated by people who had learned to treat the impossible as routine operational hazard. The aurora danced, the generator hummed, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the station's fragile circle of electric light, entities that had learned to weaponize human virtues continued their patient study of personnel, who had earned the right to continue, working in a place where survival depended on treating love itself as a hunting tool deployed by forces that understood Human nature better than humans understood themselves. 6 weeks after the storm, a new seasonal ranger arrived on the afternoon supply helicopter. Jake Morrison, no relation to Mark, despite the shared surname. He was young, enthusiastic, fresh from a forestry program at Colorado State, and possessed the kind of optimistic confidence that comes from believing the natural world operates according to predictable principles covered in academic curricula. His equipment was new, his uniform was perfectly pressed, and his expression carried the eager anticipation of someone beginning what he expected would be a straightforward wilderness adventure. Wallace conducted the standard orientation while I organized supply inventory, but I could hear fragments of the conversation that had become routine for incoming personnel. Radio procedures, equipment maintenance, emergency protocols, and finally the presentation of the laminated rules sheet that would determine whether Jake survived long enough to complete his seasonal assignment. Local safety guidelines, Wallace explained, sliding the rules across the duty desk with the same matter-of-fact delivery I remembered from my own first day. Read them carefully. Follow them exactly. Don't test them. Jake examined the rules with the polite attention of someone humoring local eccentricity while trying to identify the underlying logic that would make compliance reasonable. His expression shifted through amusement, confusion and skeptical tolerance as he read through prohibitions that seemed designed to govern interactions with entities that shouldn't exist according to conventional understanding of wilderness ecology. These are pretty specific, Jake said, pausing at the prohibition against pointing flashlights at the lake. Is this about preserving night vision, or are there actual safety concerns with illuminating water features? Wallace's response was identical to the one I'd received weeks earlier. The rules work. Follow them. After Wallace left to coordinate with other sector personnel, Jake approached me with questions that revealed both intelligence and dangerous overconfidence, in rational analysis of phenomena that resisted logical explanation. "You've been working here for a while," he said, consulting my nameplate and personnel records that identified me as experienced local staff. "What's the real story behind these rules? Some kind of environmental sensitivity issue, or just tradition that nobody wants to explain?" I found myself in the position Eleanor had occupied during my own orientation, trying to convey essential survival information to someone whose worldview didn't include adequate preparation for acknowledging reality beyond comfortable boundaries of scientific materialism. The challenge was providing enough warning to keep Jake alive without triggering the kind of skeptical dismissal that had gotten Mark killed. "The rules are tested," I said, using language that carried more weight than explanation. "Personnel who follow them complete their assignments. Personnel who don't follow them get reassigned." Jake's expression suggested he interpreted reassignment as standard administrative action rather than the euphemism it had become for disappearances that couldn't be officially acknowledged. His questions continued with the persistent curiosity of someone trained to seek logical explanations for policies that seemed arbitrary or unnecessarily restrictive. "But what's the actual mechanism?" he pressed. "Are we talking about wildlife behavior, geological hazards, some kind of environmental contamination that affects human psychology?" I wanted to show him the archives, the decades of incident reports, the carefully documented evidence that conventional science couldn't explain but which showed clear patterns of supernatural predation targeting. Personnel who treated protocols as suggestions rather than survival requirements. Instead, I found myself repeating Eleanor's advice about compliance over understanding. "The rules work because they acknowledge reality that exists beyond comfortable explanation," I said. "Your job isn't to understand why they work. It's to follow them exactly, without exception, no matter how irrational they seem." That evening, Jake accompanied me on his first patrol route, following the northern trail system through forest that felt different with 2 people walking instead of 1. His radio procedure was textbook perfect, his equipment handling was professional, and his observational skills were excellent for someone trained in conventional wildlife management. But his constant questions about environmental conditions suggested he was trying to identify normal explanations for phenomena that required acknowledging the existence of entities operating beyond standard ecological principles. Around midnight, the testing began. Whispers from the tree line, barely audible but carrying tonal qualities that suggested familiarity, despite their impossible source. Jake stopped walking and tilted his head, trying to isolate the sound from ambient forest noise. "Did you hear that?" he asked, pulling out his earbuds and looking toward shadows that seemed darker than normal atmospheric conditions could explain. "Wind patterns," I replied, continuing along the marked trail without acknowledging the voices that were beginning their systematic psychological reconnaissance. Sound carries strangely here, but Jake was already reaching for his radio, preparing to investigate what he clearly believed was legitimate communication requiring professional response. I grabbed his arm before he could key the microphone, remembering my own first encounter with entities that had learned to weaponize human psychology through perfect mimicry of familiar voices. "Don't," I said with authority that surprised me. "Trust the rules. When you hear voices that seem familiar, but can't be immediately located, the safest response is no response." Jake looked at me with an expression that mixed confusion with growing concern about the psychological state of personnel who had been working in isolated conditions for extended periods. But the voices from the tree line grew more insistent, more personally targeted, cycling through names and phrases that shouldn't have been accessible to entities operating in wilderness environments. "Jake Morrison," the whispers called, using intonation patterns that suggested family relationships, childhood memories, emotional connections that predated his arrival at Yellowstone by decades. "We've been waiting for you to come home." Jake's face went pale as he recognized voices that belonged to people who couldn't possibly be present in Yellowstone's backcountry, speaking with accuracy that defied rational explanation. I watched him struggle between professional training that demanded investigation of potential emergency situations and growing awareness that some phenomena couldn't be addressed through conventional emergency response procedures. "How do they know my name?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone whose worldview was being systematically dismantled by evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained. I led him back toward the ranger station, while voices followed through forest that seemed to be listening to our conversation with intelligence that went beyond normal environmental acoustics. Jake's questions continued, but his tone had shifted from confident curiosity to the careful uncertainty of someone learning to navigate reality that extended beyond academic preparation. "When they sound familiar," I said, adding my own contribution to wisdom that had been accumulated by personnel who had learned to survive in environments where love itself could be weaponized against people who forgot that some territories required more than professional competence to navigate safely. "Count to 30 and keep your breath. It's not unkindness. It's survival." Jake listened with the focused attention of someone beginning to understand that his seasonal assignment would require acknowledging reality that couldn't be explained through conventional training, couldn't be managed through standard procedures, couldn't be survived without absolute compliance with protocols that worked without explanation. The whispers continued until dawn, testing every psychological vulnerability that could be identified through careful observation of human behavior patterns. But we maintained our silence, followed the marked trails, completed our radio checks according to schedule, and demonstrated proper respect for entities that had been perfecting their hunting strategies since long before Yellowstone became a federal preserve. In the morning, Jake helped me update the patrol logs using language that documented unusual acoustic phenomena without speculating about their sources. His handwriting was steady despite the night's experiences, and his questions had shifted from skeptical analysis to practical requests for information about survival protocols that he was beginning to understand would determine whether he completed his seasonal assignment or became another name in Wallace's unofficial logbook. The rules held. The training continued, and another newcomer began learning that some knowledge could only be gained through survival. Some survival could only be achieved through acknowledging reality that existed beyond comfortable boundaries of institutional training. And some territories required more than federal authority to navigate safely through seasons when darkness possessed patience that could outlast individual careers. individual lifetimes, individual administrative. Cycles that brought new personnel to enforce, regulations in places where human jurisdiction was provisional, and human survival depended on treating the impossible as routine operational hazard.